Hey nerds, what's up? So over the last few months, I have been reading every single SPFBO winner to, see how they stack up and to kind of get a feel for some of the most popular fantasy self-published out there. So today in this video, I'm going to do some mini reviews on each of the SPFBO winners and talk about my ratings for them and how they stack up and how my ratings compare to their overall ratings in the competition. So I'll see you after the jump. So for those of you who don't know what SPFBO is, I have an entire video that you can watch on what it is, but basically it is a fantasy self-published competition set up by Mark Lawrence, and I will leave it at that for this video. If you want to know more, you can check out that video. Real quick before we get into the reviews, a huge shout out to my subscriber, AJ, who months ago when I asked if anybody wanted to read these with me, he said yes and has read every single one of these with me over the past few months. It was extremely fun being able to bounce ideas off of another reader as we read through these and talk about our favorites. Now, I will say that he won't necessarily offer a different perspective. We have very similar reading tastes and ended up agreeing on a lot of these books, but it certainly made my reading schedule more fun. So I appreciate AJ for that and thank you for reading with me. So let's start this off with our first winner ever of SPFBO, The Thief Who Pulled on Trouble's Braids by McClung. So this was actually the first self-published book I ever read over a year ago. If you've been following me for a while, you'll know that I've already done a review on this one, so I can keep it kind of brief. This was the only one I didn't read recently as a part of this because I'd already picked it up. And this was a pretty good introduction to self-published fantasy. It's nice because it's short, which I always appreciate when you're starting a new author if you can kind of start something with short. It's extremely clean, extremely polished, like a really great example of how professional self-pubbed can be. However, I think my biggest problem with this book is just like it's not necessarily my type of fantasy. Like I did not dislike this book, but I also didn't love this book. I feel like very neutral and average about it because it was like an urban fantasy and those settings, as you guys know, just don't really like necessarily thrill me. There were some parts I really liked, particularly this part with a hell house. It was a very interesting setting and it was very creepy and I felt like it was just really, really well done. Some things that I didn't like as much is that a lot of super interesting lore or world building stuff happened at the very end of the book, and I wish that had kind of been spread more without, because that was the stuff that interested me the most and it shouldn't happen like at the end of the book. It also had quite a sizable appendix, and usually I feel like appendices should be like an add-on, like a reminder of world building and not necessarily like lore dumps that you don't get in the book. And I felt like this one was a little bit of that. So I think maybe this book actually could have been longer to kind of build up some more of the fantasy aspects. But overall, just like a solid, good first winner. So The Thief Who Pulled on Trouble's Braid ends up in 4th place for me. This one was a little difficult. I really argued between 3rd and 4th for this one, and eventually I decided on 4th, and I'll talk about why when I get to my 3rd place winner. But yes, I'll put The Thief Who Pulled on Trouble's Braids at 4th place with a rating of 7 stars. I'll be using a rating out of 10 because that's what SPFBO does. Moving on to the second winner, which was The Grey Bastards by Jonathan French. Now, something fun about The Grey Bastards is that it is now traditionally published. It got picked up by a traditional publisher after it won the competition, which I always think is cool. The one negative thing is I think the cover that French had chosen when he was self-published was much better. I'll throw it up here. This one, like I was laughing with some of my Instagram followers, looks a little bit like an orc romance cover, which is not the book at all, but that kind of makes me laugh. I think his original cover was better, but still cool that he got picked up. Unfortunately, I really just didn't vibe with this book. The premise is about a group called the Grey Bastards who are half orc. Thus, they don't know their dads because all their dads are orcs and the orcs are evil in this book. And so they have kind of created a community by themselves, and their kind of job is to protect the human populations from the orcs. And there are other factions like the centaurs, the halflings, and the elves that also are involved to create a lot of conflict. So let's start with the positives, because on the surface, I actually quite like a lot of elements of this book, particularly the inclusion of very typical fantasy races, which can often come off as cheesy or like LOTR copies, and this book doesn't come off that way in any way. I actually find it quite compelling how he set up these different fantasy races, and it definitely did not have like the typical fantasy vibe, which I always appreciate when it can feel creative and fresh and new. So that was something I really liked. And there was like some ideas that I liked, like how would half orcs feel like they fit into this world if everybody hates their paternal line, orcs, and how would that make you feel when you're working for humans but they hate half of who you are? Like, what would that make in your world? Unfortunately, this idea that was set up wasn't really explored at all. Like, it was just taken for granted that all half-orcs hated that they came from orcs. And I felt like that lacked a lot of subtlety because I just don't believe that's how it would happen. And maybe the later books explore that, but I felt like it was a really big missed opportunity there. And I think this missed opportunity idea also flowed through other aspects of the book. For example, there's only one female gray bastard named Fetching, and at first I really loved her character. This is a very sexist world, which was an okay setup because this world is grim, this is a crass world. Like, I understand that. I understand why the author was setting up this sexist world, but like the kind of race issue, he doesn't explore it at all, and so it leaves it feeling very hollow. So in the beginning, it's exploring how Fetching must feel, you know, being the only female and kind of the sexism she experiences, and I feel like it's done in a good way until about halfway through the book, and then it all goes very downhill. Like, could not believe what he did with that character. The world is pretty bad for females, and the females look all pretty happy, which also feels very strange. I'm not gonna go super into that here. It was just missed. Like, it was set up cool and just wasn't explored enough. The book also had a level of crassness that just like isn't my thing. Again, it fit with the characters. I understood that the characters were gonna be crass, but I felt like maybe it was overboard. Like, got in the way of the story sometimes. Like, you could have pulled back a little bit. Even for things like the characters kind of display like homophobic jokes all the time, which I understand match the character, but it just gets a little tiring when like anytime a male character shows emotion, they be like, oh, you're gay. Like, it doesn't feel like necessarily necessary. Like, I think the other crassness does enough to prove your point. But beyond that, I also had a struggle with the main character because he was kind of a weird Mary Sue. It was supposed to be a grimdark book where our characters were anti-heroes, but it was almost like the author was too scared to have us dislike the main character, and that is something I have said about grimdark books before. So everybody was always responding to him like he was the handsomest, the strongest, the smartest character ever. He could do no wrong. And it just wasn't very interesting. Like, I think him as a character made mistakes, but no one else seemed to recognize that in the narrative. And so it set him up as this Mary Sue kind of who could do no wrong, and it just wasn't very interesting to me. So yeah, not my favorite. I would like to reiterate though that this has amazing reviews and also got picked up by a publisher, so I'm in the minority like usual. Probably if you're more of a grimdark reader, this is something that you're gonna like. There was just a lot of elements that didn't do it for me. I would be the first to admit that I am not the audience for this book, so don't let my review off-put you if you are used to kind of like, you love like a grimdark sort of thing, adventure with a lot of fantasy races. You'll probably like this book. This was my second to last book in the competition, coming in at 5th place, and I'm giving it a score of 4. Okay, moving on to our third SPFBO winner, Where Loyalties Lie by Rob J. Hayes. So if you follow me on Instagram, you'll know that I DNF'd this book, and it was my first DNF in 7 years. I never DNF books. It has to be a pretty extreme reason. It's been obviously years before that other one. So about 25% of the way through Where Loyalties Lie, there was a graphic, very intense, and very extreme circumstance rape scene. And this rape scene actually made me feel physically ill because of the circumstances surrounding it. And then the chapter after was from the victim's perspective, and even though I know what Hayes was trying to do with it, it gave me even worse vibes about where the story was going in respects to the victim. And so I actually put the book down after reading that. I put it down for 24 hours and was like, do I really want to DNF? I really didn't want to. But then ultimately I was like, reading is my hobby. I do reading for enjoyment. And this isn't a book I just like dislike or I'm bored by. This is a book that is making me physically feel a reaction, like bad. And why am I reading something like that? So I chose to DNF it for that reason. Now, first, a grim, dark, anti-hero pirate adventure. Again, not the audience for it. This has great reviews. If you're gonna like that, you're probably gonna like it. And 2, I actually have read Never Die by Rob J. Hayes and really liked it. If you've seen my review on that, I can link it above. So this is nothing against the author either. Like, I love Never Die. It's probably my second favorite self-published I've ever read, and just like a good book on its own right. And I'm gonna read the sequel to that. I've been meaning to get around to it. So I like Hayes' work. This storyline just wasn't for me. So this comes in 6th place, obviously, because I DNF'd it, but I will not be giving it a star rating because I am very personally against giving star ratings to DNF books. I feel like it's not fair for me to rate this book because I do not know what happens. Like, something may have happened that made that scene make sense in context and a lot better. So I'll refrain from rating it, but I will put it at last place simply because I DNF'd it. Okay, on to our 4th winner, which is Orconomics by Zachary Pike. Okay, I'm really excited to talk about this one because I actually liked it. Yay! I feel like we started with some ones I didn't like, but I really liked Orconomics, and this was one of the ones I was actually the most excited to read and is the one I started with. You know, I'm a huge Terry Pratchett fan, and this is a satire, and so I just was hoping I'd get something good out of it, and I think it delivered. It's like a Pratchett that satirizes RPGs and MMORPGs, so if you're into that sort of thing, I think you'll like this. This book succeeds the most when it is satirizing its namesake, which is Orconomics. It has a lot of sections in this book that satirize RPG economics and play styles and how the economics in those kind of games would actually work in real life, and I think it's very well done. It was very funny, very clever, and it is definitely where it succeeds the most. I do think it loses focus a little bit, which I've found some of the other satire that I've read, traditionally published or self-published, kind of fails. Like, Pratchett's very good at keeping focus, and so I wish this book had focused a little bit more on the economic aspects instead of just kind of randomly satirizing a lot of things, simply because it shined the most there. But I mean, I still enjoyed it. And because of that, I think this book was the weakest near the end, where the book turns more serious and moves away from satire. I kind of wish it had kept that light tone throughout. You know, when I think of Pratchett, like Guards is a good example. There's some serious stuff that happens in that book, but it's always kept on this kind of like level of humor. Same with Good Omens, another really good example. And so I think that's a huge skill, and like, I'm comparing this to Pratchett, who is the genius, you know? So I think it does good. I just think that could have been tweaked a little bit. I also maybe could have cared a little bit more about the characters. There were some I cared about, some I didn't, but overall, like, a super solid read. And if you are like a World of Warcraft player or a D&D player or anything like that, I think you should definitely pick it up. You'll chuckle, you'll find it funny. And so I put this in as my number 2 favorite of SPFBO with a rating of 8. Okay, on to our 5th winner, which was The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. So this book's incredible. It's amazing. It's gonna be one of my top 5 books of the year. Just need you to understand how excellent this book is, and if you've been hearing about it and you're like, maybe I should pick it up, you should pick it up. It's incredible. So first things first, this book is brutal. It is grim. It is a Japanese-inspired military fantasy, and it gets dark. It follows the Matsuda family, particularly the mother Misaki and her son Mamoru. It's a story about the horrors of war and propaganda and family and roles and all sorts of things. I need you to keep that in mind when I'm about to talk about this, because it might make the book seem different than it is. I'm gonna talk about one aspect of it, but just kind of remember that this is like a war book, and you know, it's dark and brutal and violent. So I fell in love with this book for many reasons, but one of the primary reasons I want to talk about is just Wang's depiction of a mother in fantasy. We get so few depictions of motherhood in fantasy. They're usually side characters, very rarely primary characters, especially a mother with living children. And so already that's a kind of a representation I don't see a lot in fantasy, and then it was just done so excellently. I think Misaki may be my favorite representation of motherhood in fantasy that I've ever read. The commentaries on motherhood in this story just made me feel so seen. One of Misaki's main kind of internal struggles is the way that she had to divorce from her previous life when she became a mother. The complete erasure of who she was before she bore children. And this is something that I've experienced as a mother, and all of my friends with children, mostly mothers who experience this, where all of a sudden once you have children, no one remembers who you were before. It was like that didn't exist. Like, you weren't a person before you gave birth, and everything becomes about your children. And it's not that you don't love them and love that part, but you are also like still have this other identity. And how do you blend that identity with your new one as a mother and just the way that was explored without becoming overpowering in the story was just so amazing. And particularly how Wang didn't just make one story. She had many different women to tell their sides. There were women who were perfectly happy with their role. There were women who were happy with their role but still questioning other things and fighting. And then there was a woman who hated this situation she was in her family and didn't want to do it. And just so rarely in fantasy we get to see the breadth of different personalities and people and how they can react to the same situations. And it was just such good representation that I just felt so moved by it. And it's so cool because usually it's this unseen thing when women feel like their past has been erased. But for Misaki, like, there's an actual physical metaphor of her literally burying her past beneath her floorboards. And that representation of that feeling was just masterful in my opinion. There was also just this scene, and it's inconsequential, it's not a spoilery scene. It's where, two female characters are talking about a woman who miscarried. And it was such an interesting scene because it really had a lot of complicated emotions in it about how a woman may feel about miscarriaging and how it can still be a very sad time even though she didn't really want to have a baby. It's such a nuanced discussion and it's almost a throwaway scene. And it was just like this reminder of why I need to see more women in high fantasy as authors, because it's not that a man couldn't write that scene, it's that I don't know if he would think to write that scene, because as something that he couldn't experience, you haven't had those emotions with you your whole life. I just can't say enough about that part of this book. Beyond that though, this was the perfect level of grim for me because it was horrible and it made me cry, which I never do in books, and this book made me cry. And it was sad and it was violent, but it also had just that little spark of hope, which is something I like. I like having a book with some hope in it, even if it's so dark. So that was perfect for me. And I felt so emotionally connected to these characters. I was rooting for them. I liked them. I wanted them to succeed even when they weren't. And that kind of emotional connection to a story or characters is definitely vital for me in connecting to the book itself. This is also a great example of a book that publishers might overlook simply because it actually has a very unique plot pace. Usually we are used to the 3-story structure in our fantasy novels, and I've talked about that before, where we kind of have the rising action, then the climax and falling action. This one was really interesting because the Sword of Kaigen kind of follows more of a theater production 5-part story structure, because the climax happens directly in the middle of the book and then half the book is falling action, which is very interesting. It's not something I've really read before, and I can understand how a publisher might be scared of that because it's very atypical. I think it worked excellently for this novel, and it definitely gives it a unique experience, so I enjoyed it, but I can see how that may be off-putting to some readers. The couple very small negatives I'd have about this book is that it technically is a standalone, but really it's a prequel to a trilogy that the author was writing. And so because of that, there is a specific character, Robin, who really only serves to connect this prequel to the main trilogy, particularly in the last chapter. The last chapter feels very out of place because its only purpose is to connect it to the trilogy. And so it just is kind of a weird tonal shift for the book, and I kind of wish it wasn't there. Additionally, there are some things about the world that are unexplained. I was fine with this. I didn't think it hurt the novel, and I think it's because those things are explained in this other series. It might be like trying to read the prequel to the Hunger Games without ever reading the Hunger Games. There might just be a few things you're missing. I don't know. I haven't read that prequel, but I'm just making assumptions. However, that wasn't really enough to make me dislike this book. I thought it was amazing. Surprising no one, based on that review, Sword of Kaigen is clearly my number one, far and above. I love this novel. I gave it a 9.5, taking off the 0.5 simply for those things I mentioned, but still just an incredible book. Please, please read it. One quick interesting fact before we move on is that Wang actually stopped writing her trilogy. I was kind of looking into the trilogy because I liked Sword of Kaigen so much, and she has a blog post. I'll try to link it below if I can find it again, basically saying the trilogy wasn't going where she wanted it to do. She kind of wasn't proud of the work she was writing, and so she decided to put it away. So she didn't actually even finish the trilogy. So for me, I'm just gonna stop at Sword of Kaigen because of that, but I know she's in the works for a different book, so I'm excited for that. And finally, last but not least, our newest winner, The Lost War by Justin Lee Anderson. So overall, I liked our newest winner. There were a lot of things to like, but there were also some things I struggled with. The biggest thing I'll say about this is that I knew something before going into it. Now, I'm not gonna say what I knew, because I'm hoping followers of my YouTube page won't have heard this. But in the SPFBO sphere, this fact was really well known. And it's like a non-spoiler spoiler. So it's akin to someone being like, oh man, you won't believe when you read the newest Stormlight Archive what happens between Kaladin and Shallan. Like, oh my gosh, you won't believe it. It totally took me by surprise. And like, that's not a spoiler, but it kind of is, because now you're expecting something. Now you're like, oh, what's gonna happen? And then you're trying to guess, you're trying to use context clues to make an assumption, and it's kind of no longer a surprise. So to that similar vein is something that was told to me about The Lost War, and because of that, I guessed it very early on, and I was thinking about it the whole book, and I feel like it hurt my enjoyment of the book, which I think kind of sucks. And so I want to put that up front because I'm wondering if I would have enjoyed the book more if that wasn't always on my mind. So do me a favor, if you decide to read The Lost War, don't look up reviews about it, because I think if you don't know the thing, it's a lot better. That being said, there were a lot of pieces of world building that I really liked about this book. In fact, the setting was probably my favorite part. There were some very interesting monsters, some interesting lore, some very interesting settings that I wish we could have spent more time in. Like, I liked the setup of it. I was interested in the world that Anderson has created. As for characters, I felt like for the most part, they were pretty average. I kind of had a hard time getting invested in them, except for Samily, who I absolutely loved. I loved her the entire novel, and her storyline actually ended up being the most interesting to me. Some of the surprises that happened with her were the ones that shocked me the most, and I was just the most motivated by her storyline. I really thought he did a good job with her character and making her interesting, and so I was the most connected to her. So there were a ton of good things about this book. I just had a hard time kind of feeling invested. It kind of felt like maybe a little boring sometimes, and so I kind of wished the thing that I knew about, instead of happening near the end of the book, I wish it had happened near the midpoint of the book. I think that would have made the pacing a little bit better. I just think it had really good bones. There was just some execution factors that made this book not like over the top enjoyable. Overall, I see why this book won. I see why it's so appealing. It has a really good setting. It has grim characters, grim monsters. That's, pretty popular. And there were characters definitely to root for. Like, I clearly rooted for one. For me, I think it was because I knew this non-spoiler spoiler that kind of ruined the reading experience for me, and I think it could have just been streamlined a bit. So ultimately, obviously, as it's the only one left, it fell in third place for me with a score of 7. Ultimately, why I decided that this one beat out The Thief Who Pulled on Trouble's Braids is that if I was going to read a sequel, I would for sure read the sequel to The Lost War. Like, I would never think of reading Braids' sequel, but I would read The Lost War sequel. So I think ultimately that means something, and so that's why it edged out Braids for third place. So our final stack up is number 1, Sword of Kaigen with a 9.5, 2, Orconomics with an 8, 3, The Lost War with a 7, 4, The Thief Who Pulled on Trouble's Braids with a 7, 5, The Grey Bastards with a 4, and 6, Where Loyalties Lie with no score. Now, I went to compare this to the ranking for the other SPFBO winners. Now, this isn't perfect because different blogs participated in different years, so it's not like a one-to-one comparison, but interestingly enough, there are 3 that are tied for first with an 8.65, and they are Sword of Kaigen, Orconomics, and The Grey Bastards. That's interesting because obviously Sword and Orconomics were my first 2, so I clearly agree with their high scores in SPFBO. The Grey Bastards makes sense that it was rated so high since it got traditionally published. Obviously, like, my lowest score I gave, so, just personal preference. Their 4th is The Lost War with 8.35. Their 5th is Where Loyalties Lie with an 8.1. And then finally, in last place, the first winner, which is Thief Who Pulled on Trouble's Braids with a score of 8. Some interesting facts is that for The Thief Who Pulled on Trouble's Braid and The Lost War, I gave them both a score of 7, and that is tied for the lowest score they both got in their respective years. So both of them only one blog gave them a 7, and that was their lowest score. So I guess I agreed with those blogs those years, or maybe I am just a harsher rater, which I could get behind. I think I kind of am. I don't give a lot of perfect scores. Like, if you see on my Instagram all the books I read, like, I feel like I can be a pretty harsh rater when it comes to books, so I guess that tracks. As far as Where Loyalties Lie, which is the one I DNF'd, the lowest score I got actually was a 4, but that was only by one blog, and every other blog gave it 8.5 plus, so maybe it is just like a polarizing book. If you're okay with that scene, you're probably gonna like it. If you're not, you're not. I think that's just kind of how it is. Also, I gave The Grey Bastards by far the lowest score because the lowest score it got in its year was a 7 and I gave it a 4. So again, probably just don't trust my review on that book. I did want to talk about one more thing before we end the video, which is that it kind of makes sense to me that basically all but 2 of the winners are grimdark. Mark Lawrence is one of the kings of grimdark. He started this competition. It makes sense that the blogs who are most interested in participating are probably already fans of Mark Lawrence and prefer grimmer books. So it is important kind of knowledge to have that the, SPFBO winners tend to skew much more grim than just like average fantasy. And I realize this may be extremely obvious to all of you, but I realized something while I was doing this, which is just because a book won SPFBO doesn't automatically mean you'll like it. Like, you should still take in your personal preferences when you're picking self-published books to read. I realize that sounds obvious, but let me continue on. Like, it shouldn't be any surprise. The two books out of all of these that I would have chosen for myself off the shelf, whether they were winners or not, let's just pretend they were in a bookshelf, were Orconomics and Sword of Kaigen. Both of those kind of storylines interest me a ton. And shocker, they were the ones I liked the most. They were my highest scores by far. I would have never in a million years picked up a grimdark pirate fantasy. Okay, I would have never picked up a book called The Grey Bastards. I just wouldn't have done it. I don't like crass books, and like literally on the cover, what does it say? Let me read it. Hold on. Mark Lawrence on the cover says, "A filthy, charismatic, and frankly excellent read." And there's something on the back that says something like, "Not for the faint of hearts, a dirty, blood-soaked gem of a novel." Like, none of those adjectives are things I would pick out. So I wouldn't have read it normally, So I feel like, why would you trust my reviews on those? Really, SPFBO is just a great way to kind of cull out maybe some of the unprofessional novels and kind of give you a good 10 semifinalists to look at. And so for me, like going forward, I'm not gonna really care much about like who won, but there's a ton of semifinalists with very different subgenres of fantasy. And I think if you're gonna go pick self-published, instead of just looking at the winners, go look at which books actually interest you out of all the finalists. There's been 6 years now, so that's 60 books for you to go look through and pick ones that you liked. For example, Never Die, which I really loved, came in 5th place the year it was in the running. But that's a book I picked up on my own, so I was probably more predisposed to like it. So that would kind of be my advice. If any of these winners appeal to you, I would for sure read them, but I wouldn't read them just because they're winners. I'd go and look through the semifinalists to kind of pick the ones that you would already naturally pick off the shelf. And there are plenty like that, so I will for sure continue to read SPFBO finalists. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if I like them more than some of their finalists that year, just because I tend to skew less grim as a reader. Okay, thanks for sticking with me through this really long video. I want to know which, if any, of the SPFBO winners you have read and what you thought about the books. Have any of these books interested you, and did I convince you to pick them up or convince you not to pick them up? Do you absolutely hate how I rated The Grey Bastards? Please let me know in the comments below. I want to hear all your thoughts about that. I'm very excited about the current SPFBO competition. I've been following it very closely, and I'm just so ready to see who the finalists are. I will probably continually keep reading the winners even after what I just said, only because at this point I've read them all, so I might as well, keep going. I just think it's very fun, and I'm very grateful for that competition. As always, if you like these kinds of videos, please like and subscribe, and if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.